It is fitting and proper that as a director of the Special Studies of the College of Jewish Studies, I should open my radio talks in a series of philosophers, saints, and poets I have known with a Christian saint and hero, perhaps the greatest of the active saints now living, Albert Schweitzer. Because men of goodwill and of all faiths are celebrating the 75th anniversary of Albert Schweitzer all over the civilized world and in many parts of the not-so-civilized world. The name of Schweitzer is now known to many millions, though I remember that a short 2-3 years ago, when I arrived in America and mentioned Albert Schweitzer in my talks and lectures, very few people, with the exception of a few well-informed men and lovers of great music, knew anything about this most extraordinary moral hero of our half-century. It was only in the last year, on the occasion of Schweitzer's first visit to this country, to deliver the inaugural address at the bicentennial Goethe celebration, that the popular magazines and newspapers gave Albert Schweitzer the publicity usually reserved and paid for by film stars or boxing champions. When Schweitzer arrived in New York and was confronted with a sizable army of reporters and press photographers, he remarked with good-natured irony, "You are giving me a welcome as if I were an international banker." And to a friend, standing aside, he added, "A banker that has come not to ask for a loan from the United States Treasury." Schweitzer loves to laugh, and at himself most of all. But who really is Albert Schweitzer? That he is famous, everybody knows. But what is he most famous for? Is it because he is a great musician? Is it because he is a great theologian? Or because he is a great doctor? Or is it because he is the most self-sacrificing of medical missionaries in tropical Africa? Or is it perhaps that he is one of the noblest religious philosophers of all time? Or is Schweitzer one of the most penetrating critics of our civilization, whose work has deeply impressed itself on the modern mind? Or is it because Schweitzer is the greatest organ player of Bach's divine music, whose life and work of Johann Sebastian Bach, though written by Schweitzer over 40 years ago, is still the standard classical study of the sublime composer? The most amazing thing is that he is immensely difficult, and that it is very, very difficult to choose from those stupendous accomplishments in all these various fields of human endeavor. And the difficulty lies in this. It is impossible to choose because Albert Schweitzer is truly great in all these branches of religion, music, philosophy, theology, history, medical missionary work, and a few more. Now, this is the astonishing thing about it. And here is the absolute uniqueness of Albert Schweitzer's personality. Nobody like him has ever been known, as far as I am aware, in the history of man. No wonder that in this age of specialization, it is awfully hard to conceive of a man of Schweitzer's magnitude and grandeur, who achieved greatness and creative originality in so many fields, one of which, for any other human being, might have been more than sufficient to fill a full, splendid life work with abundant glory. Now, you will readily understand, and you will not wonder when people ask you incredulously, what is Schweitzer's greatest contribution to life, to humanity? What is he most famous for? The average man is simply and excusably dazzled and puzzled by the manifold character of this unique man. Where is he to pigeonhole? Where is that little pigeonhole that you can put him in? Where is the convenient label you can stack on him? Where is the classification you can classify him with? Where is the measure? Where is the yardstick one could measure him with? I must confess that it is very awkward, very clumsy, if not wholly unprecedented, to call a man one of the very greatest missionary, doctor, musician, theologians, philosophers, historians of religion writer, organ authority, and Bach player of all time. Now, this is a mouthful, isn't it? It sounds exaggerated, doesn't it? Almost unbelievable. Don't you think so? And yet, believe it or not, it is absolutely true. Still, I have not mentioned to you his most wonderful quality as a human being. But let me first tell you how I had the good fortune and honor to be first introduced to this rare man, Albert Schweitzer. That was 15 years ago in my young student days in London, England. I spent then most of my days in the world-famous library in Europe, the British Museum Reading Room, the spiritual home of every student and scholar from the remotest corner of the civilized world. I said I spent most of my days. I would have gladly spent most of my nights there too, were it not for the wise precaution the museum authorities have taken against such incurable bookworms, fellows like me, and closed the doors at 6 in the evening. Flashed with a youthful ambition and enthusiasm to reach, like Faust, the unattainable, and to master all knowledge and all wisdom accumulated in the last 2,000-3,000 years, and nothing less, of course, will do when you're young. I tried to cope with the 6-odd billion books that are kept there, and was most of the time quite miserable at the thought that seemed to have budded greatly 200 years ago the wise and witty Frenchman Rabbi, that everything has been said and written before, and there is nothing left to be said. In the course of my philosophical and historical readings, I came across one day at the writing of a certain professor of theology, Dr. Albert Schweitzer, on the historical Jesus and the mysticism of St. Paul. I was greatly impressed by the new and refreshing approach on a subject on which countless libraries have been written. Some time later, I took out a thick volume, The Life of Bach, to which I was referred to by the other studies of this composer as the greatest authoritative work on Bach's music. And the name of the author was also Dr. Albert Schweitzer. On another day, I opened a book called The Decay and Restoration of Civilization, and the author was again Albert Schweitzer. I was astounded at the amazing knowledge of this man and the clarity of his vision. But I knew yet nothing about the men that stood behind these scholarly works. I had then a very dear friend, the celebrated Viennese Jewish writer Stefan Zweig, for whom I had a great admiration not only as an exquisite novelist and penetrating biographer, but as one of the truly great Europeans and as one of the most delightful and the most splendidly civilized men. Stefan Zweig asked me at that time to do for him some historical research work at the British Museum. Now, I used to see Stefan Zweig almost daily. He was quite often depressed and in a melancholy frame of mind at the moral degeneration of Europe, and it seemed that all he worked and lived for was disintegrating on the continent. One day, he came to me into the British Museum with his gentle smile on his face and with his brown eyes radiant with inner light and happiness. We went to one of those little restaurants which he liked to discover for himself. He was in an unusually happy mood. After coffee, he lit a cigar and suddenly asked me, tell me, have you ever met a saint? A real saint? Well, I murmured a few hymns, astonished at the question, and trying to think of a real saint. I couldn't think of, that is, I could think of one only, whom I had met a few years ago, but he was now at least 10,000 miles away in India. Come tomorrow, said Zweig, to St. Margaret's Westminster Church, and you will meet him. Albert Schweitzer is in London, and he is playing for the Bach Cantata Club. I knew very little about Schweitzer, except for a few books that I have read in the British Museum. It is not so amazing when you consider that the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, printed in the late 30s, does not even mention Schweitzer's name. But I knew that he was a great Bach player and a missionary in French Equatorial Africa. Have you read, my friend Stefan Zweig asked me, his autobiography? my life and thought, and on the edge of primeval forest, I admitted that I have not read. Then a shattering experience awaits you, said my friend. And so I promised Zweig that I shall get them the first thing in the British Museum in the morning. Meanwhile, I begged Zweig to tell me something about the man. He knew Schweitzer intimately and corresponded with him, and a few years earlier, on Schweitzer's rare visit from Africa to Europe, Zweig traveled across the continent to spend a few days with him in Ginsbach in Alsace. And Zweig said to me, this was my most unforgettable day when I came to see him, and I came in contact with holiness, with saintliness. That evening, Zweig told me about Albert Schweitzer, whom I was to meet the following day. Schweitzer was born in Ginsbach in 1875, January the 14th, the son of a well-known pastor in Alsace. At the age of 24, he became the ordained preacher in St. Nicholas Church in Strasbourg. Everyone believed that the young minister will walk in the footsteps of his father, as he was the most popular preacher, and his sermons were eagerly listened to and discussed. But the young pastor was not satisfied with such a comfortable life. He was groping for more light in his religious quest, and he wanted to translate his preaching into the reality of life with all its poverty and spiritual and physical misery. Here already we see that the great Christian, going back to the very origins of Judaism, which was the foundation of the Jewish prophet's religion and which found its apogee in the teachings of the Jewish Jesus of Nazareth, religion without a moral social conscience, but with faith alone and without deeds, is unthinkable for the ethical man. And so Schweitzer forsook the pulpit and went amongst the poor and needy to bring to their homes bread and medicine as well as the word of God. In order to get these material things, Schweitzer used to go from house to house of his friends and acquaintances and beg them for money in order to buy the necessary things. 2 years later, Schweitzer, lecturing at the Theological University, was invited to Paris as a full professor. In the French capital, his academic career was assured. But again, the academicians and the professors were mistaken about the brilliant young philosopher and theologian. Young Schweitzer was now immersed in the world of music. Since his early youth, Schweitzer was playing the organ, and he was brought up with a deep love for Bach. Now, during his vacations in the summer, he became acquainted with the greatest living organ master and composer, Widor, who immediately foresaw a tremendous future for this young professor of theology as a Bach exponent. Now, Schweitzer began to study under Widor, and very soon the master told him, "You have nothing more to learn." Very shortly afterwards, we hear Schweitzer as the acknowledged virtuoso of the organ, and his concerts would take him from Barcelona to Stockholm, from London to Munich, and from Strasbourg to Paris. The concert halls are packed, and the critics as well as the public have acclaimed him as the greatest interpreter of Bach. With the money earned from his concerts, he can now do the things which he wanted to do most of his life, to help those who needed most his help. Meanwhile, his master Widor impressed upon Schweitzer that he is the only man that could write a definitive life of Johann Sebastian Bach and bring out an authoritative edition of Bach's works, the lack of which was very much felt, particularly in France. It was while writing the book on Bach and being lionized by music lovers of Europe as a concert virtuoso, and at the same time being regarded as an eminent theologian and philosopher, as well as the greatest authority on organ building, Schweitzer decides to leave Europe and to go to Africa to become a missionary. Yes, it was an unbelievable decision. And when this decision was taken, only one person knew, a young woman, the daughter of the Jewish professor of history, Helena Breslau, who was later to become his wife and most devoted companion. And the beautiful intellectual woman promised her future husband that she would accompany him into darkest Africa and share with him his work there. But when his friends in the musical and academic world heard of Schweitzer's decision, of his fantastic plan, they hardly believed that he is really serious about it, while the others thought him almost insane. All of his friends tried to persuade him about the hopelessness of such an expedition, especially when they heard that he wants to build a hospital in the jungle. They were horrified at the idea that a man who has achieved at the age of 30 such a splendid career as a musician, or rather 3 careers as a philosopher, theologian, and historical writer as well, should leave all that, with all its fame and prestige, and settle as an obscure missionary with the savages of darkest Africa in a seething jungle of tropical disease and primeval horror. Yes, but they did not know Albert Schweitzer. None of these things troubled him. He gave no thought to the fame and acclamation of Europe, and still less to the material comforts that his fame could have brought him. What bothered Schweitzer was something much more important. He discussed this with his young bride. With what shall we go to Africa? What will we bring them? Only to teach them the Bible, or preach for them some simple sermon, or make them wear Mother Hubbards? Surely, that's not enough. Anybody can do that with a simple faith. He wanted to build a hospital. But why in Africa? Hasn't he seen enough misery and suffering and want in Europe? But he chose Africa because it is the hardest job, because it is the most difficult mission, because of the terrifying sleeping sickness and yellow fever and black water and the diseases that civilization brought to Africa. He wanted to atone for the crimes and exploitations that the white man has brought to God's creatures in Africa. He wanted to atone for the sins and neglect of the white man in Africa. He must build at least a hospital. But how to build a hospital if he knows nothing about medicine, let alone tropical medicine? Because Schweitzer had to be the doctor as well as just the builder of the hospital. But for Schweitzer, no difficulty was unsurmountable. So he puts everything aside, his Bach, his organ, the university lecture, the ministry, his doctorate of philosophy and divinity, his theological books and his historical studies, his critical work on European civilization, his studies on the Logos of St. John and the mysticism of St. Paul the Apostle. He turns his back on all the fame and glory that was already his, and Albert Schweitzer, having passed already the age of 30, decides to become a student and to study medicine and to sit together on the bench with boys of 18 or 20. He had no money, of course. He slightly forgot that. And he had to maintain himself and pay for his studies by giving a few concerts here and there when he could spare the time. And after 6 years of hardship, at the age of 36, he finally had his state examination as a medical doctor. And then another year as an intern and doing clinical work. Finally, his medical thesis. And then, nearly 38, he's ready to leave. Only one thing was lacking. He forgot again. Money. He refused to accept, of course, a subsidy from the French government in order not to be under the control of red tape. He had also difficulties with French Missionary Society, which was very reluctant to accept him as a missionary owing to his unorthodox views. A little bit dangerous, you know. Schweitzer is forced to give a few more concerts, and helped by a few devoted friends and admirers, he manages to get a considerable amount of medicine, drugs, surgical instruments, and in the summer of 1913, he arrives with his wife in Lambarani, And with the help of a few natives, he starts building, with his own hands, a few primitive huts in the tropical jungle. Without any white help, with Mrs. Schweitzer as his sole nurse, with an old chicken coop as his office, he began the fight against the diseases which were decimating the natives of equatorial Africa. But within a year, August 1914, the first suicidal madness broke loose in Europe. The First World War was raging. And Albert Schweitzer, being an Alsatian, which meant then a German, was considered naturally an enemy of France. And he was made a prisoner of war and was later not even allowed to treat his patients, although thousands were clamoring and hoping for his help. In 1917, the French authorities considered him too dangerous to be left in Africa and brought him back to Europe with other prisoners and interned him in the French Pyrenees. Here another prisoner introduced himself to Schweitzer as one who was in debt to him, because Schweitzer, having been the means, though indirectly, of curing his wife of an illness in Africa, and asked what could he do to serve him now. Schweitzer desired nothing so much as a table. Yes, just a table. His fellow prisoner at once contrived one of some loose wood in the loft, and then he said, now I could write and play the organ. For before we left the boat, I had begun some organ practice by using a table, just an ordinary table, as manual, and the floor as pedals, as I used to do when I was a boy. Schweitzer wrote later. Only a musician can appreciate the concentration required for this mute playing. Though he was the only medical man among the interns, he was at first forbidden to attend the sick, but later he was allowed the same privileges as the dentists, and the governor of this concentration camp placed a room at his disposal. Thus I was once more a doctor. What leisure time I had left, I gave to the philosophy of civilization. And Schweitzer added, I was then drafting the chapters on the civilized state and practicing at the same time the organ on table and floor. Yes, that was Albert Schweitzer in concentration camp. After the war and the liberation, he came back with his wife, who shared all these hardships with him, ill and exhausted, to his little town in Ginsburg. He found many of the houses there in ruins. He was too tired to lecture, and the only thing he could do was to practice again his beloved organ in the ancient little church. But he had still debts to pay for the hospital bills that he incurred, and in order to pay these bills, he starts again on a concert tour in one capital after another to raise his money. Had all his work in Africa been in vain? Have all the sacrifices that he had made been just for nothing? Has he given 10 years of study of tropical medicine to accept now his fate as a failure? No. Schweitzer would not accept such a verdict. He would not be discouraged by his first external defeat in Africa. And in 1924, Schweitzer goes back to Lambaréné, where everything he built was destroyed, where the jungle has eaten away the wooden buildings, and everything has to be rebuilt again in another place on a bigger scale. He now had a few European assistants, and he was promised help from his numerous friends all over Europe. His hospital became the most famous in Africa, conducted by the superhuman will and self-sacrifice of one indomitable man. But still, he had to come to Europe every few years in order to give concerts and lecture at universities, and thus to raise funds for his hospital. Yes, and it was on such a visit to London, on that October evening of 1935, that I went to St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, with Stefan Zweig to listen to Schweitzer. I do not think that I have ever before or since experienced such a religious revelation through music. It is impossible to doubt in the divine purpose of men's life when one listens to Schweitzer playing Bach. After the concert, we stood around him, we shook hands with him, and one felt his powerful grip. And the voices that spoke to him sounded extraordinarily weak, merely whispers. Only he spoke with a resounding voice. The most saintly of men does not look ascetic at all, but robust and full of health. Thick black moustache, and then only beginning to get grey, with a face of an iron will, and yet a face that can light up through eyes full of humility and kindliness. On the following morning, I had the rare opportunity of listening to him while he played for recording in a beautiful little All Hallows Church in the city of London. I understood then better the central point of his philosophy, and that is reverence for life. A phrase which occurred to him while on a long journey on the Okinawa River in equatorial Africa to visit some sick people in a remote village. He then found the formula: reverence for life, for all creation, not only for your fellow human being, but for the animal world and all vegetation, for the flower and the blade of grass. Reverence for life through the word of God, to do his will of compassion in this world. I understood then, listening to him playing Bach, the divine spark in men that can bring forth such human beings as Albert Schweitzer, or, for that matter, a Johann Sebastian Bach. Now it so happens that the 75th year of Schweitzer's life coincides with the 200th anniversary of the death of Johann Sebastian Bach, the man, as he said himself, who wrote music for God alone. Let me, therefore, share with you the incomparable pleasure of listening to the greatest interpreter of his music, and let us, in silence and in reverent meditation, bless the hour when the divine musician was born, and give praise to God for having given to our age of anguish and dissolution a man like Albert Schweitzer, in whom men of all faiths must rejoice. Listen to Albert Schweitzer playing from the cantata number 4 by Johann Sebastian Bach.